You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is July 30th, 2020. And I actually woke up early this morning to do this interview, and I was going to do the interview, take my cat to the vet, and then I was going to come home, do the intro and the outro, and then squeeze it all together and make a show, which I'm going to do. But I took my cat to the vet today. She wasn't feeling very well. She's 3 years old in May. We just got her spayed. Took the cat to the vet because she was throwing up. She seemed very lazy, very sad, very not wanting to do anything. And it's very unlike her. So I get down there and, going through the whole thing. Oh, well, she's probably just constipated. We'll give her an enema. We'll run these, blood test results and just make sure that everything's okay. And sure, okay, so we'll go ahead and do that. And came back out, and the vet told us that her kidneys aren't working anymore. So we're going to have to put our cat down tomorrow morning. And it's kind of a sad time for us all here. So if you have any good vibes, you can send us. I do believe in miracles. Good things can happen. We do have the cat here. She's not in any pain, so that's good. But there's nothing to fix her kidneys. We're not going to be able to fix her kidneys. So, if maybe you can say a prayer or think good thoughts or whatever it is that you believe in, that would be great. So moving on, we got a show to do. Today we have Katherine Chiljan is going to be joining us. She is the author of Shakespeare Suppressed. Katherine is an independent scholar who has studied the Shakespeare authorship question for over 30 years. She debated the topic with English professors at the Smithsonian Institute and at the Mechanics Institute Library in San Francisco. She has written several articles for Shakespeare Oxford Newsletter and served as its editor for 2 years. She is currently on the Research Grant Committee for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Chiljan has given talks on the Shakespeare authorship question in numerous public libraries, clubs, universities, and bookstores throughout California. She is a frequent guest on radio shows and podcasts, including Coast to Coast AM in 2018. And Shakespeare Suppressed is definitely an interesting book. It's a nonfiction research book about Shakespeare's biography and his works by Katherine Chiljan. 448 pages, color plates, extensive endnotes. The feature film Shakespeare in Love was a romantic fantasy about the great author, yet most Shakespeare biographies are filled with similar fantasy and speculation because so little is known about him. Furthermore, scholars have been studying Shakespeare's plays and poems for over 200 years, but basic information about these incomparable works, like their composition dates, is still lacking. So, she has an interesting theory about who he is and why they tried to cover it up. So we're going to give it a listen, and we're going to talk to her and find out what's going on with Shakespeare right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. We're with Katherine Chiljan. She wrote the book Shakespeare Suppressed. Katherine, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
How is your day going? How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Woke up to a beautiful day out here in Northern California.
Now, Shakespeare Suppressed is a book. It says here, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works. You seem to think that Shakespeare isn't Shakespeare. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, you are. In fact, this is a controversy that's been going around since the 1850s. when Delia Bacon wrote a book about it, and it has never stopped the controversy. And the reason why there is a controversy is because the person that we all think wrote the works, his name was William, actually born William Shakespeare, that's the way it was spelled in contemporary documents. There is no lifetime evidence that this man was actually the author of the Shakespeare plays. And we're talking about lifetime versus after death evidence. All the evidence after his death is what makes the indication, but not during his lifetime.
So it was a cover-up that was happening while they were alive. So
I believe actually Shakespeare, there were two people named William Shakespeare. One was a pen name, and one was the man born with that name from Stratford-on-Avon, and we call him the Stratford man. Yes, and they lived at the same time, but in my opinion, after they both died is when the confusion started, and I think that was deliberate. That was like a cover-up. Yes.
So let's unravel this. So who died first?
Well, the person who I believe wrote the plays, his name Edward de Vere, and his title was Earl of Oxford. He was a nobleman, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And
so why the cover up? Why would he now? Do you think the two of them knew each other?
I think that the Earl of Oxford knew the Stratford man, knew who he was, because he actually lampoons him in a few of the Shakespeare plays. If you read it correctly, his name is William, and he sort of identifies who he is. That's in As You Like It. But you kind of have to read it to pick up these clues, name clues, that it is him. But as far as the Stratford man goes, he was a real person. He was born, he was christened, he was married, his children were christened, he purchased real estate, he owed taxes. We have a lot of records about this man. But the problem is, none are related to education or writing. And that is how the controversy really started. When, for a few hundred years, scholars were trying to find more information about this great Shakespeare. Mostly intense scholarship started in the 18th century. And for a few hundred years, they weren't coming up with anything. And the reason is they were looking at the wrong man. If they would realize that it really was a pen name, then they could probably find who the real author was.
So what are some of the clues that you've been able to figure out?
Well, I have a whole chapter in Shakespeare Suppressed where I go over the contemporary references, made by people who were alive when Shakespeare was alive, and they referred to him. And you have to really read these passages carefully. You can't just, look at them on the surface. You kind of have to go underneath. Like, for example, one of them calls Shakespeare our English Terence. Now, Terence was a writer in the Roman times, classical Roman times. And it was believed that Terence was actually a cover for two authors who were of the nobility. So by calling Shakespeare the English Terence, it was like saying Shakespeare is a pen name, right? So you have to look at these references carefully. And if you do, which is what I did, they're telling us that he was a man of high rank, that he wrote anonymously or with a pen name, that he was a patron of writers, that he was well known to university students, that he was dead by 1605. And we have also other references that he was dead by 1607 and thereafter 1609. Now, those numbers don't work for the Stratford man because he died in 1616. So if we look at this evidence, it's not pointing to the Stratford man, it's pointing away. And then if you look at the biography of the if we look at the profile of the great author, he was somebody with an intense amount of schooling. I mean, had expert knowledge on many topics, like medicine. There's over 600 references to medical issues. He knew the law. He knew French and Italian language. He knew about astronomy. He knew about how the aristocracy spoke, their language, the court language, and their customs, their sports, things like that. He was very well versed in that. You take all these things, rhetoric, music, all the things that he had expert knowledge. This is just looking at the plays. It had to be a man with this type of level of education. And yet, the Stratford man, the best we can say is that he maybe went to the local grammar school till about age 12 or 13, something like that. That's what the story goes. Now, if you want to look at the Earl of Oxford, there's a huge amount of evidence on his education. He had tutors when he was very young, private tutors, and he was so apt a student and so well, into the education part that he was sent to Cambridge when he was 8 years old, Cambridge University. That was very young. And he got a bachelor's degree from there. And then at age 16, he had a master's degree from Oxford University. And then he went on to law school. And a few years later, he took a grand tour of Europe. So, I mean, all the elements are in place, for him to be the great author.
Yeah, so at the time that these plays were happening, they were pretty much being written for the Queen, right?
Yes.
Isn't that where the plays were carried out, like at the Queen's Castle for Queen Elizabeth?
Yeah, you're right. And that is really something that the Shakespeare scholars today, they do not seem to emphasize that, or maybe they're not even aware of that. But really, the plays were written for her originally. They were not written as today's scholar would say, oh yeah, he was writing for money, for the theater, for the public theater.
So was the nobleman William Shakespeare, was he at these plays?
He probably was. He may have even been acting in them. In fact, an anecdote has survived saying that Shakespeare was acting before the Queen, and she by accident had dropped her glove, and he picked it up and carried on with his speech, ad-libbing with that. I mean, this is an anecdote. We can't prove it was true, but if he was performing before the Queen, there should have been some sort of, recollection in historical recollection that, the great author Shakespeare met the Queen. We have recollection and correspondence between her and other authors like John Lyly and Edmund Spenser. He was the poet who wrote The Faerie Queen. Some people may be aware of that one. So, there's just a big blank. And we have, as far as the Stratford man, we don't have any payments to him as a writer. Nobody took notice of his death in 1616 when he died. So everything's just a big blank with the Stratford man, and all the circumstantial evidence is on the side for the Earl of Oxford.
Yeah, so were there any payments to him for anything?
Well, there you go. There's another interesting information about the Earl of Oxford. He was granted a £1,000 annuity for the rest of his life. And back in those times, £1,000 was close to like $1 million today, So he was the only person who was a poet and a dramatist because he was known as a poet and dramatist, the Earl of Oxford. He's the only one who was given an £1,000 annuity. And not too long after the Stratford man died, about 50 years later, there was another anecdote that said that Shakespeare spent at the rate of £1,000 a year. So here's another possible parallel.
Yeah. So what would be the reason why the Earl of Oxford would need to use a pen name?
Yes, it's a very good reason. The Earl of Oxford was a nobleman. He held one of the oldest titles in the land, the Earldom of Oxford, which was founded like around the year 1200 or so. And nobility back then should not, that was the mindset of the nobility, is that they should not be working and they should not be involved with quote unquote frivolous activity. And writing poetry and drama was considered that. So during his lifetime, he did not want it to be generally known that that was his main activity in life, writing plays. And but after his death, it would have been okay, and we have proof of that because one of the fellow courtiers of the time, Sir Philip Sidney, he was a poet and with a very high reputation, but during his lifetime, his works were not published. His creative works were not published. We do have one or two works of literary criticism that did get published, or political things that got published, but not with his name on it. But as far as creative works, none. When Philip Sidney died, a few years later, his sister published her brother's works and put his name on it with no problem. Now, that courtesy was not extended to the Earl of Oxford. And that is really the great problem and the great question for us to try to understand. And in the last two chapters of my book, I give my theory as to why that happened.
So Earl of Oxford, he does have writings that are out there that he actually wrote that you can read?
Yes, we have about I forget the amount, about the 30 or 40 letters that have survived in his handwriting. I actually held one at the Huntington Library. That was very exciting. And he had some published poetry. Now, not whole works, just like pieces, like, one or two poems in one work, a few poems in another work with other authors. Just little ones, not like an entire work.
Yeah, do they seem to match up with what Shakespeare wrote?
Well, yes, actually, someone wrote a book comparing phrases in his letters with some phrases in Shakespeare, and he used a lot of similar terms. So, I mean, at least there's something there, something we can compare. But with the Stratford man, we don't have any surviving letters at all. Nothing in his handwriting survives. Now, that's something when I tell people, they just can't comprehend that. Somebody who supposedly wrote about 40 plays and was totally into the literary world, and we don't have one sample of a letter or a note. All we have are 6 signatures that appear on documents, legal documents. One document has 3 of them, and that's his will. And on each page, he signed it, they're a different signature. So it appears like he could barely hold a pen, the Stratford man. And he's the one we're getting all the accolades for writing Hamlet and King Lear and all those wonderful Romeo and Juliet. It's wrong. He's not the man. We've got to correct this.
But they thought he was the man at the time, even. So when he
No, that's another interesting thing. During the Stratford man's lifetime, no one made the association between him or Stratford-on-Avon and the great author. Nobody knew it until after he died. And this, the main thing, we can talk about it, the main culprit is the first publication of Shakespeare's plays. We call it today the first folio. Folio because it's a reference to the large page size. So it's a big book, and it held 36 Shakespeare plays. And in the opening pages of this book are tributes to Shakespeare. And by different writers wrote these tributes. And one writer, Ben Jonson, in his tribute, he called Shakespeare Sweet Swan of Avon. And then if you turn the pages, a few ones later, another poet referred to Shakespeare's Stratford Monument. So you have two references, one Avon, one Stratford Monument. You put them together, yes, there is a town called Stratford-on-Avon. And that's precisely what people did. They made this connection. And from that point on, people started visiting Stratford-on-Avon. But the Stratford man was dead, and Earl of Oxford, of course, had been dead about 19 years at that point. So, yes, this was fabricated after both of their deaths. And the first folio, the opening page is a large image of a man, which we can all recognize today, that black and white image of a man with a big forehead. I'm sure you know it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that's the only known image. Well, we do have an image on the monument in Stratford, because there is a monument to a Shakespeare in Stratford-on-Avon. That's another clue to put the authorship there.
Now, the image on the cover of your book, is that the image that you're talking about?
No, the image on my book is a cover of the Earl of Oxford.
Okay. All right.
Right.
And there's a lot of pictures of him, right?
We have a few of them, yes. And if you go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, the organization I'm part of, they have many images of him. But the image on the first folio in 1623, interestingly, did not depict an author. If you can look up that engraving, that black and white engraving, you'll see that what's missing is like a book. Now, back then, if you were an author whose works were being published, usually there'd be a pen or a book or something, some sign to show your trade. Also, there might also be laurel leaves, around your head, or being held in your hand. Laurel leaves, that was a sign of poetic victory. But we don't have anything like that in this image. We just have an image of a gentleman, really, with a strange shaped head. And in fact, some people think that it may be a mask because it looks more like a mask. And near the ear are two lines where there should only be one line. And that could also be a giveaway that is meant as a mask.
All right. Well, I'm looking here on it's on what? What picture is that?
Well, if you want to see the Earl of Oxford, you can see it on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website. But if you just Google, Shakespeare's image, you're going to see a black and white picture. That's going to come up.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the famous one that appeared on this book.
Oh, I see. I've got it here. The line that runs from his ear down.
Yes. You can see these two lines. So it kind of gives that impression. But the interesting thing is that just opposite, on the opposite page of that picture, is a verse by Ben Jonson, and he tells the reader to not look on this picture. So that was a very odd thing to say. I mean, why even use the picture at all if you should, reader, don't look at it. Look at his book, he's telling you, meaning read the plays, and that will tell you who he is.
Yeah. Now, I'm taking it that the reason why they did this is pretty much because of politics. Could it have anything to do with the banned speech about Sir Thomas More?
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're referring to.
I was reading somewhere last night that Shakespeare actually had something. He wrote something that was banned because it was controversial in that time about Sir Thomas More. I don't know. Maybe I'm just sounding like an idiot, and I'm completely.
Sir Thomas More was a play that it's believed Shakespeare had a part in it, but no, that hasn't been verified.
Okay.
There's a couple page manuscript that has survived, and they think that maybe Shakespeare may have been one of the people writing in the writing, but yeah.
So this controversy goes back to even Mark Twain, doesn't it?
Yeah. In fact, in 1909, he published a book called Is Shakespeare Dead? And he just could not marry the man, the person who wrote these plays with the Stratford man. And so he believed that he was somebody else. I think that he didn't know about the Earl of Oxford back then, that our theory started in 1920 for the Earl of Oxford being the great author by J. Thomas Loney. But what really got Twain interested in the topic is the expertise in the law that Shakespeare had. So you had to go to a law school to write what he wrote. And the Earl of Oxford did go to law school. We have the enrollment records of that period, and there's no William Shakespeare listed. So, yeah, I mean, everything points to the direction that A, it was a pen name, and B, that it was the Earl of Oxford. And in fact, the character in Hamlet, Prince Hamlet, he's like a description of the Earl of Oxford. Hamlet was a university student, so was Oxford. He was a nobleman, so was Oxford. He was a courtier, so was Oxford. He was a traveler, Hamlet was Danish and he went to England, traveled to England. Well, Oxford actually had possibly Danish blood, or certainly French blood, and he took a tour of Europe. A great parallel is when the Earl of Oxford was coming back from his European tour. He was in Europe for about close to a year and a half. His ship crossing the channel was attacked by pirates, and they took him, they almost killed him, and they took all of his goods. He was stripped down to his shirt, apparently. And one of the people in the crew recognized that he was somebody important, so they spared his life. So, I mean, he could have died right then and there. Well, the same thing happened with Hamlet. His ship was attacked by pirates. So, you start getting these parallels, and the circumstantial evidence really becomes overwhelming.
Yeah, it's like Hamlet was a story of his own life.
Exactly. So either the great author was the Earl of Oxford, or he knew him very closely. He knew his life. How would you know? How would somebody from a provincial town, humble origins, who had no contacts at the court, how would he know about the Earl of Oxford's life? I mean, it's just was unreasonable for that period.
Now, there's also you mentioned the book that the picture was in a little while ago. Isn't there something about the blank pages in there?
Yes, I bring up that point in Shakespeare Suppressed. It's, we're talking about the opening pages, the preface, in other words, and then the rest of the book, like 900 pages, were the plays. But in these opening pages, you don't have any biographical information about who the great author was. Nothing at all, other than Avon and Stratford Monument. And yet, as you mentioned, there's 5 blank pages, big pages. There was plenty of room to put more on it, like, a little bit about his life, or maybe his coat of arms, because the Stratford man, his father acquired a coat of arms. That should have been on there. There could have been lots of things they could have put in there that tell us a little bit more about him. But instead, we have all these blank pages. So, again, this points to something being a little suspicious. Also, As you turn over the page where you see that image, you can see the dedication letter. It was written by Hemmings and Condell. They were two actors of the period. But over the centuries, scholars have examined this letter, and it turns out it was actually written by Ben Jonson. And I even give the proof in there. I mean, it's not that I discovered it. It's been known that Ben Jonson actually wrote this letter. And interestingly, the letter was written to two very prestigious noblemen, the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery. They were two brothers. They're both Earls. And they have intimate connections to the Earl of Oxford. The Earl of Montgomery married the Earl of Oxford's daughter, Susan. And the Earl of Pembroke almost married another daughter of the Earl of Oxford. So they were intimately acquainted, and it turns out that since they probably sponsored this book, paid for it, it was a very expensive production. As I mentioned, it's like 900 pages, big pages. It cost a lot of money. And they think that about 270 of these books have survived. So it was a precious book back then. And who would have fronted the money except these two earls who the book was dedicated to? The story by the Orthodox scholar is, it was just his, the Stratford man's buddies, the Hemmings and Condell, the fellow actors. They're the ones who sponsored it. It can't be so. It was just it would have cost too much. And but anyway, these Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery had to have been part of the cover-up. That's what I say. Now, let me also qualify myself too. There is evidence that the Stratford man was involved in the theater, and I don't want to deny him that at all. But based on my research, it was basically only as a financier, just somebody who fronted the company's money. Because the very first indication of the Stratford man being in London was with, or his association with the theater. He was 30 years old, and he was one of 3 people to receive a payment from the Queen's treasurer. And the payment was for putting on some just some plays. I can't say Shakespeare. To put on plays. Now, if you put a play before the Queen, which is what it was for, it had to be, a pretty nice sets and costumes had to be involved if it was going to be before the Queen. So that would require the acting company to have money, to front it, because they got paid afterwards. So it's my belief that the Stratford man was, a financier. And we also have, in the same line of logic, he was a theater shareholder for the Globe and for another theater called the Blackfriars Theater. So he was 100% involved in the theater, and he was actually listed as an actor for King James, the king who succeeded Queen Elizabeth. He was listed as a member of the King's Men. But unfortunately, there is absolutely no evidence that he was a writer. So, but I do want to qualify that, yes, he was involved in the theater. And I think that's how he became known as the great author, because his theater involvement was known. So making the confusion possible would have been easier in that sense.
Yeah, but when he died, nobody noticed.
That's right. Nobody noticed. They only noticed it when this first folio book came out, the collected Shakespeare plays, 1623. Yes. So. And
that would have been 7 years after his death.
7 years after his death, yeah.
Were there any new plays that came out after his death?
After the Stratford man's death?
Yeah.
Yes. Two Noble Kinsmen was a play that came out. And I think that was, I'm sorry, I don't know all of them, but I think At least that one. That came out in 1634.
And when did the Earl of Oxford die?
He died in 1604.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, before the first folio was published, only 17 of the about 40 Shakespeare plays were printed in smaller versions. They call them the quartos. And if you look at their condition, they're terrible for the most part. At least half are almost unreadable. See, what we're reading today are 250 years of editing. That's why they're readable today. But if you actually go to the originals, which you can look at it on the British Library. They have a lot of on their website. They have the originals. They're very hard to make out.
Yeah, were they written in pen, I guess?
No, these were printed editions.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have any play manuscripts of Shakespeare that have survived, which is, again, a bit unusual. But the point is, they're in terrible condition, and that means the great author was not giving the plays to be published. He wasn't giving them to the authors, to the printers to publish. He was not making money from them in his lifetime. And again, that's totally against what the scholars, the Shakespeare professor would tell you today. Oh, no, he was writing for money. He was an actor for money. He was writing plays for money. It's not the case. Why would he want his printed works to come out imperfectly? There's every evidence that these were editions where they put people in the audience and they took stenography to write it down. Oftentimes a character is named by the actor's name, things like that. So yeah, they're kind of a mishmash, some of these early editions. And even when Romeo and Juliet first came out, that was in 1597, it was so bad they called it a monstrous theft. A contemporary said that in a play. So, why was the great Shakespeare, why was he letting these, pirated editions come out? And I think that if the Earl of Oxford, owned up to it, then it would be telling the world that he was the great author Shakespeare, which he didn't want to at the time when he was alive. And so I think that these printers were taking advantage of it, that he was in a catch-22 situation.
Yeah. Do you think the Queen knew who the real writer was?
Oh, yes. She definitely. Because these plays were written for her originally, in my opinion. And like, for example, let me just give you, in 1577, the Stratford man was like 13, I don't know, in his teens at that point. A play was performed before Queen Elizabeth, and the title was A History of Error. Does that sound like a Shakespeare play you may be aware of?
No.
The Comedy of Errors. So it very well may have been written in 1577. So that would totally exclude the Stratford man, because I said he was a teenager, and he was not connected to the court. There's a few other references like this where the name of a Shakespeare play, it's a different title, probably appeared in a different title. So, yes. Okay. So definitely the Queen knew who he was. And I think that part of the reason for the cover-up was that this courtier, the Earl of Oxford, he was putting the Queen in some of the roles. He was putting some powerful people in some of these character roles. And I think it was kind of a joke. The courtiers all thought it was funny, or, except for the ones who were being lampooned,
Yeah. So he didn't want to lose his head, so to speak.
Right. And it turns out the Earl of Oxford married the most powerful man, married the daughter of the most powerful man in England, and that was William Cecil. He was the Queen's secretary, treasurer. He was everything. He really ran the government back then. And the Earl of Oxford married into his family. After Burleigh died, he was called Lord Burleigh. After he died, his son, Robert Cecil, took over the helm for the Queen. So these two very important men were associated with, like, for example, in Hamlet, it was Polonius, and he was it was not a flattering portrayal. And during his lifetime, Robert Cecil, his son, a lot of people took him to be like Richard III, the hunchback villain.
Uh-huh.
So, a lot of people associated Richard III with Robert Cecil. And this was fostered probably from the Shakespeare plays. So this is not something that the family would have wanted to be known. That, hey, if you know that the great author really was this courtier, the Earl of Oxford, then you're going to look for these characterizations. You're going to say, oh, yeah, that's Lord Burleigh right there. Oh, that's Robert Cecil right there. And they didn't want that. I mean, I think that's part of it.
Do you think that the Earl of Oxford had a thing for the Queen?
Yes, actually, it was known. They were very close when he was in his early 20s. He was her favorite, for a few years. And actually, if you read Shakespeare's sonnets, which they're 14-line poems,
Mm-hmm.
and Shakespeare wrote 154 of them. And these were written in the first person, they're highly personal. And he tells, he describes who he is in these sonnets. And he also greatly praises a young man, a beautiful young man. And we refer to him as the fair youth of the sonnets. And if you read some of these sonnets to the fair youth, there is some indication that the great author thought he was royalty. He like addressed him as he would a king or a future king. And it could be very well that it was his son by the Queen Elizabeth. I know it may sound fanciful, but you have to read them, and you have to look at the Earl of Oxford life. You have to look at the reality of Queen Elizabeth, how she was rumored to have children throughout her lifetime. I mean, commoners would cite these rumors at the risk of, being thrown in jail. So it's not quite an unusual concept if you get into it. Even though she was known as the Virgin Queen, I think that really was just a kind of a PR device, because you have a woman, the Queen, kind of assuming, the leadership of the Church of England,
Yeah.
And they kind of wanted to turn her kind of into the Virgin Mary in a way, that kind of identification, to make it maybe palatable to the people at the time. I mean, there's other reasons for it, but.
So how far back does this conspiracy go?
Well, as I mentioned, books started coming out in the 1850s and thereafter. And our theory was founded in 1920 by a great book called Shakespeare Identified, and by J. Thomas Loney. And he was a schoolmaster, and he taught English, he taught Shakespeare plays, and he just couldn't marry the traditional line about the Stratford man being the great author. He just didn't see it. And what he did is he made a list of characteristics of what the great author had to have known and been like. And also he looked at what poet used a certain rhyme scheme, like he used for Venus and Adonis. That was the first poem that was published with the name William Shakespeare. It's a long poem. So all of these characteristics plus this certain rhyme scheme, he only found one author using that rhyme scheme. One was anonymous, and the other was the Earl of Oxford. So that plus all the characteristics that match the Earl of Oxford, that's where he made the discovery. But actually, as far as doubts go, there were doubts as early as 1640, not too long after the folio came out. And what happened was someone published a book of Shakespeare's poems that included the sonnets that we were talking about and other poems. When you open the front page, there's also an image, just like in the first folio, and the image resembles the one in the first folio. And there was a poem beneath this image, and the first line was, "This shadow is renowned Shakespeare," with a question mark, "the soul of the age?" question mark. And there's more to the poem, but those first two lines are saying, hey, this image in the first folio, this really is the great author William Shakespeare? And that was as early as 1640. And also in another book in 1640, a different book, somebody wrote a poem to Shakespeare, and one line was, "Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise." So that's a very odd thing to say about somebody who has had his great acclamation during his lifetime and after his death, and a big book of his plays were published. Actually, at that point in 1640, 2 editions of those books came out. So why was it necessary to be silent to praise Shakespeare? And my answer to that paradox is that he was not praising him in his real name. He was praising him in the pen name, not the real man's name, who was Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. So there's lots of clues like that out there. And if you take them in cumulatively, you're going to come to the conclusion that the great author, was the Earl of Oxford, and that he was using the pen name William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare was actually a logical pen name for him because the Earl of Oxford was a champion at the joust. And the jousting instrument was called a spear, a long spear. So he was a spear shaker. He shaked the jousting instrument, William Shakespeare. And actually, on about half the time the name Shakespeare, meaning the author, about half the time the name was printed, it had a hyphen between shake and spear, which is an indication of the action of spear shaking. And also back then, a hyphen gave the indication of a made-up name. So that also is covered. So the Earl of Oxford, he fits like a glove, and he was also a known playwright.
Yeah, you'd think that there'd be money in this. Is there any surviving family members of the Earl of Oxford today that...
Well, the Earldom of Oxford died out in the 1700s because the last Earl, the 20th Earl, only had a daughter, and so it pretty much became extinct at that point. The daughter married a duke, the Duke of St. Albans. So some of the collateral descendants are from the Duke of St. Albans, and actually the present Duke, his son Charles, he goes by the name Charles Beauclerc. He wrote a book about this, and he also did a tour in America about 25 years ago or so in America. And, purporting, the Earl of Oxford, who his collateral ancestor as being the great author. So, yes.
He did? Now, why wouldn't he be able to go after, like, say, the publishing rights? Or, I mean, I don't understand how I guess books from a long time ago and, if movies and things are made today, that the family of the writer usually gets some kind of monetary, benefit from that.
Well, I mean, it's not.
Why wouldn't they
It's
come
not
out?
accepted that he is the great author, unfortunately.
So what about the family of the William
Stratford
Shakespeare?
man.
Yeah, the Stratford man. Is there any family of him still around?
his family died out with his granddaughter. His granddaughter lived in the later 1700s. And interestingly, the Stratford man had two surviving daughters. Nobody went to Stratford to go talk to them to, say, hey, tell us about your famous father. Nobody did that. Nobody interviewed them. Nobody interviewed the granddaughter, the surviving granddaughter.
So who owns the rights to his work?
They're public domain.
Oh, are
Yeah.
they?
Yeah, there is no rights.
Well, I guess that ends that then, huh? So why do...
Yeah, but that's good. But, when we have the right author, maybe the Earl of Oxford, there's very few comparatively in our movement compared to the thousands of Shakespeare scholars. If we can get those thousands of Shakespeare scholars looking in the right direction, we might be finding more information. We might be able to find, which is my great dream, find the original play manuscripts. If we found one page of play manuscript, the controversy would be over. We would know whose handwriting it was, because we have letters of the Earl of Oxford that have survived. So,
you'd be able to compare the penmanship then.
What?
You'd be able to compare the penmanship then.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's many reasons why we have to get on the right track, give due credit, where credit is due. I mean, if you wrote Romeo and Juliet, wouldn't you want to get the credit? I mean,
well,
so
if I was dead for 250 years, I don't know.
Well, maybe he's in spirit, still alive. Who knows?
So this controversy has been going on, you're saying, since maybe even before the 1850s.
Yes.
Why hasn't it been resolved yet, do you think?
That's a good question. A very good question. I think, I think that the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, I think they did a really good job with the first folio in throwing the authorship on Stratford-on-Avon. And no one has really looked back. No one's questioning this. Even though if you talk to a Shakespeare professor today, he'll tell you, yeah, there's problems with his biography. We don't know much, but they kind of shrug their shoulders and say that, I'm sorry, nothing we can do about it. But I don't accept that. Not when you look at what contemporaries were writing about the great author. Not when you have the profile of the Earl of Oxford, laid out, not just in Hamlet, but in other plays too. Like, for example, All's Well That Ends Well. It opens with Bertram. He's underage, and he becomes a ward of the king, meaning the king has custody over him. Well, that was the same concept with the Earl of Oxford. He was 12 when his father died, the 16th Earl, and he became a ward of Queen Elizabeth. And he was raised in the household of, we mentioned him before, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. This is a direct parallel right there. And also Bertram in the play, he was forced to marry someone against his will, somebody he didn't think was qualified because he was somebody of high rank, and the person that the king wanted him to marry was not. Well, the Earl of Oxford, William Cecil's daughter, I think she was enamored of him and wanted to marry him, and I think that her father wanted to marry into this great line of earls, and he fixed it, and they were married. In fact, but it took 2 tries. There was a first wedding, and evidently he didn't show up because it didn't happen, and then the second time it was. So there was some hesitation there on the Earl of Oxford's part. So again, these are just 2 parallels.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier about an effigy with an engraving at the Shakespeare Monument in Stratford.
Yes.
Something about a pen or something?
Yeah, that's a great one. If you go to Stratford-on-Avon today, which is a small town north of London, I think more north than Oxford University, you will go, if you go to the church, Holy Trinity Church, You go inside and you're going to see a monument on the wall to William Shakespeare. And he's a guy, bald guy, holding a pen and paper, resting on a pillow. Okay, fine. That's a slam dunk. This is the author, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning the Stratford man. But if you look at, again, contemporary evidence going back to 1634, just a few years after the Stratford man died, you're going to see a totally different image. And this image was made by William Dugdale. And he wrote a book of all the monuments in that area of Warwickshire, or many of them. And he was, he was knighted for his role in doing this type of work, and antiquarian work. And it's a totally different image. Today's monument, the man has a upturned mustache and a goatee. The image on Dugdale in 1634, he's got a drooping mustache and a full beard. The Dugdale image, he's not holding a pen and paper like today. He's holding a sack. And the Stratford man's father was a dealer in wool. So it's our belief that, and I didn't found this theory, Richard Kennedy did, that actually the original monument was to the Stratford man's father who dealt in wool, and he was holding a wool sack. And somehow the monument changed into a man holding a pen and paper. So, something happened here. And it probably happened by 1623 when there's a reference to Shakespeare's Stratford monument. So what they may have done is just changed the wording on the monument, just left the effigy alone of the man with the sack and the drooping mustache. They left that. They just changed the name on the inscription. That's my guess.
Huh.
And then later it got changed.
Well, it all seems pretty interesting. Is there any
intrigues? There's so much intrigue surrounding this topic. It's really it's amazing.
So what did it for you? What was the one piece of evidence that was just for you was just like, yeah, this is definitely, the real guy?
Well, I think it's the life parallels. The fact that the Earl of Oxford was a known poet and playwright in his day, but none of his plays have survived with his name on it, right? They very well were the Shakespeare plays. And also, you read the sonnets, and, he kind of indicated that his works may not be known by his original name. Like, for example, I can read a line. My name be buried where my body is and live no more. That's sonnet 72. He says he's addressing the fair youth, and he's saying, "From hence your memory death cannot take, although in me each part will be forgotten. Your name," meaning the fair youth, "your name from hence immortal life shall have. Though I once gone, to all the world must die." That's sonnet 81. So he seemed to be aware that it was the pen name that was going to live forever and not his real name. And he wasn't happy about it. It's kind of, for me, ultimately, it's the injustice. And we're just not talking about any old writer, We're talking about really one of the titans of Western civilization.
Yeah, well, he even created his own language, didn't he?
Well,
sort of. Not created his own language, but he made up. A lot of the words we use today were created by Shakespeare, right?
You're totally right. Yes. In fact, they say about 2,000 new words were coined by Shakespeare. And not just words, but famous phrases like "neither a borrower nor a lender be," or there's so many. "To be or not to be," "foregone conclusion." There's there's so many. You just read Hamlet, and it's phrase after phrase. So famous.
Yeah. Now, were any of
We're
those
speaking language today.
phrases or words in any of his letters?
I don't think directly. No, no, sorry. I mean, those letters that have survived, they're kind of mostly more business letters. They're not like poetic letters.
Yeah.
But there are parallels in some word usage. Yeah.
It was definitely very interesting.
Yes. So, whether we know it or not, we're speaking his language today. And I think it's time to give him the right credit. And I think that when you know the true biography behind Shakespeare, you're going to enjoy the plays because you're going to see these things that he experienced, that the Earl of Oxford experienced in the plays, and it's going to make them more enjoyable. And that's another reason why I'm kind of on this quote unquote crusade, to get the word out about the Earl of Oxford. Unfortunately, English professors, they don't really want to address this issue, most of them. And so it's up to, the people in the general public to do the work. And that's kind of my mission.
Well, hopefully, your mission is a success.
Me too.
Yeah.
Well, all thanks to you for giving me the opportunity to
I
do
definitely
so.
appreciate you coming on. Do you want to tell everybody where they can find your book, where they can find you?
Yes, shakespearesuppressed.com is my website, and you can buy the book through Amazon, or you can write to me, and you can send me a check. It's on my website. The information
To get a signed copy, right?
You can also ask your public library to buy it. I mean, it's a research book. It's not a fiction. I have 600 footnotes, and on my website is the ISBN number. You just give them that number, and hopefully they'll buy it for the library, because this really belongs in the library. So, yes, for researchers, future researchers.
Are you in libraries like in college libraries that you know of?
Yes, there's some college. I'm in UCLA, my alma mater, and a few others. Yeah, and also even a university in Korea has a copy. If you go on WorldCat, you can see where they are. So.
Well, that sounds great. Well, we certainly appreciate you coming on the show today.
Thank you.
we hope that everybody gets to go and check out your website, shakespearesuppressed.com, and we'll be right back on Conflict Radio right after this. And welcome back to Conflict Radio. Be sure to go to shakespearesuppressed.com and check out Katherine's website. It's definitely an interesting story. Make sure you subscribe and like the video. Subscribe to the channel, Conflict Radio Network. Remember, you can always find us on Spreaker and Apple iTunes and iHeartRadio podcasts and just about every podcast catcher out there. You can find us. You can also find us on the internet, www.conflictradio.net. We've been working on putting together quite an interesting website there for everybody to go and look and check out, and all kinds of different shows and different things. We're up to, I think this is episode 16 now. We're getting up there. And I'm going to go and spend some time with my kitty. And until next time, batten down the hatches and be safe.